Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the family in history. This is an incredibly thick chapter, and it does browse over several incredibly important themes that would take a series of volumes to actually cover the evolution of the family for the last 10,000 years. So, albeit we have to consolidate it into one chapter, but some of the common themes about the evolution of the family over the last several thousand years are the declining birth rate over time, the transition from the family as more of an economic unit to more of one of companionship and love and closeness and support. So the chapter definitely cannot do justice to this. Again, we would need several books, but that's just something you guys should be pulling out is the idea that the structure of the family has changed and evolved over time. And some of the major ways that it has changed are with the size of the family, the roles of the family, and then the overall goals of the family. So many other factors are associated for why this happened, including social change. Again, you have the evolution of society over thousands of years. You have the formalizing of society, the bureaucratizing of society, social change regarding things like equity and justice, improvements in technology, which has made housework not as extensive as it once was. The idea of childhood, which used to never exist until in more recent times. The idea of prolonging that idea of growing up, for example. Okay? So we've had a lot of changes that have occurred in the family. Family role norms have changed. You guys are seeing this in modern times. We did go from a time of traditional gender roles for the idea of a father being a breadwinner and a mother being a homemaker to an entirely new set of roles, and that doesn't necessarily even require a mother and a father, for example, because you have the introduction of all kinds of dynamic ways of putting families together, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a heterosexual, heteronormative family, for example. You've also had a great lifespan increase. So over time, people are living longer, and that's a result of, again, the increase in the healthcare, increase in technology, increase in food production, etc. As a result of that, also child mortality rates have decreased over time. So that's the idea that back in the day, the book talks about how it was expected that 1 out of 5 would die in childbirth, for example. We also had high rates of mothers dying in childbirth. But as a result of improved technology and medical knowledge and the healthcare system in general, the well-being of mothers and children has greatly increased, okay? The book also talks about the idea of the interaction between the state, the market, and the family. And again, that's talking about different institutions that structure society. Again, if we apply a functionalist family or perspective to society, the family is a major institution of society. So is the government, so is the education system, so is the economy, and all these interact with each other. Think about it. What happens to the family when there's a Great Depression, for example? And you can see how economics influence the quality and well-being of the family. And you've also seen a decrease in the nuclear family. The idea of the nuclear family, and your book talks about this, we'll talk about a little bit more, but your book even described the nuclear family more as a myth of the 1950s. And I thought that was very interesting how your book described that. But again, this idea of a man and a woman having a family with their children that never ever divorce, that is almost a minority family type in modern times, for example. And so we need to be appreciating all the diverse structures and systems for families, different ways they can be combined, the different definitions of families, how they've evolved over time, how they're currently changing right before our eyes. And so again, your book is talking about some huge themes here that we cannot do justice in delving into. But again, if you guys are interested in the history of the family, that's a great thing to study. If you guys are interested in gender roles and how that's changed over time, that's a great thing to study. If you're interested in demographic factors like the studying of child mortality, divorce rates, marriage rates, things along those lines, age of first marriage, age of second marriage, all of that is great for demography. So there's a lot of stuff that you guys can study here, but the book's just, it's only one chapter, so there's only so much that you can really cover in this, but hopefully you guys pulled out some really good themes. Okay, so the early history of the family. Again, you had this idea of prehistory, and we, through anthropological And archaeological discoveries have realized that the nuclear family has existed for a long time. However, when we actually study the bones in the genetics of the families that have lived thousands of years ago, we found that they were commonly buried with people that weren't even their immediate family also. So you had this idea of the extension of a family beyond just a mother, a father, and the children that's been going on for thousands of years. So one question you can ask again from a functionalist perspective is, what purpose does the family serve? And again, the family is not only a primary agent of socialization, but humans require that support. A baby needs that kind of interaction. Humans are not built to be able to take care of ourselves from birth. We have it built into us to be social and to need each other, to work together to be able to survive in this kind of an environment. So the book talks about the idea that children cannot survive without a community, that we need all these people in our lives to socialize us and take care of us until we can then play the role of the socializing and the caring. The book also talks about diverse family structures. And again, when you study the psychology of sexuality, there are brain rewards for both monogamous relationship, being with one person, and then also brain rewards for the instant gratifications of like a hookup, for example. So as a human sexually, you're capable of both being with one person for your entire life, or serial dating, or just being with all kinds of people. It's built into your genetics. And so, but when you do study the brain rewards of that, you do find that monogamous relationships over a lifespan tend to offer the most brain rewards, which is just an interesting side study into sexuality if you guys are interested in that at all. But what the book also talked about, that actually I didn't know this until I had read this book, and so again, you're always learning new things, is the idea that actually polygamous relationships were the most common form of relationship in pre-early history. And that means having multiple partners, multiple people that you're married to, even though we can't state for sure that they had, marriage like we do in modern times, because they might not have socially constructed a ceremony, and a ritual that are attached to that. But the idea of a partner having multiple significant others is the most likely in prehistoric times, and they kind of brought up an evolutionary psychological reason for this, more like survival of the fittest, talking about the strongest having the most mates and things like that. And some of that's really arguable, but it's an interesting argument that your book makes, okay? But one of the main things that it talks about since the early history of the family is this idea that the family size has been decreasing over the last 10,000 years. And your book has a great chart on that. It shows the evolution through the hundreds and decades, through the centuries and decades that show all of that. It's very interesting to look at. All right, so Europe to US. This is how your book coined it, because the book says that it's highly more focused upon the experience of family in the United States. Instead of anthropologically studying all family types in all cultures, the book is saying we're going to really focus on the United States. And to understand the United States, you have to understand a bit about how, U.S. culture, the origin of it is European culture, aside from the other cultures that were already here, such as Native American culture. But Native American culture, again, was decimated by guns and disease. And so you have the influence of all kinds of other multi-dynamic cultures in the United States. But the dominant family type, the dominant family structure comes from the dominant culture. And the dominant culture of the United States did originate in Europe, and specifically in the United States, England. Okay? So England had cultural domination, and they used cultural imperialism to impose their culture upon the people that were already here, those that were colonizing, and then those that were either immigrants, came over to work, or those that came over as slaves, okay? So England, and specifically European males, and European males eventually started thinking of themselves as white males, hence the origin of race and where race comes from. Europeans wanted to dominate the social class system in the United States. So not only did they impose their own cultural power, but they also put themselves at the elite upper class social positions and then subjugated all minorities into the lower classes, therefore reducing their power, reducing their life chances, reducing their influence over culture. And evidence of this, if you guys look in your textbooks, what you're going to see is most of the textbooks were written initially, and the people that are in your textbooks are light-skinned males. And it's not until later that you start to see other minority races and ethnicities, along with females being represented. So the family structure, again, is similar to the idea of European male domination in that the initial family structures in the United States were dominated by males, okay? Males not only had cultural power, political power, but they also had economic power, and they had religious power, another institution of society, because women, for example, were not allowed to be pastors during this time. And again, this is a very restrictive environment. So the family structure is, built, the dynamics of the family are built around the idea of male being a head of a household. And this has been challenged over time. But what you're going to see is this idea is in flux of who gets to dictate what, whose roles are what. And that's where a lot of that social change comes in. Because again, these traditional gender roles that were instituted by European males upon colonizing the United States, and that family structure that became our family structure for hundreds of years has since been challenged, okay? So the book definitely stresses the idea of inequality between groups, again, racial and ethnic groups, and then also gender roles by sex groups, male and females. And then later on, when the conversation of sexuality and gender start to arise, again, you have your sexual orientation groups, and then your non-conforming gender identity groups also that begin to play a role a little bit later in history, but not so much for the first 200 years of our history, because again, those were social taboos that were unacceptable at the time. Okay, so initially, the beginning of families, it wasn't about love. It wasn't about companionship. Again, it was all about this economic relationships and power. And did that person's farm have a tool they need? Therefore, they'll marry off their daughter to that family, for example. And so the idea of the family structure was seen kind of more like a business, and that everyone had a role to play, and that pre-technology, especially like children and things, were necessary and just to be able to fulfill all the roles. So when you guys study the division of labor in society, and again, way beyond this chapter, a lot to it, that is something we're talking about right now, but the division of labor in society has changed over time. But the initial division of labor over time began that, men would be doing the work outside, definitely the hunting and things along those lines. Females would often work the fields and then do the housework, and then children had their roles to play, and everything was very clearly cut in stone. Okay, so the idea of marrying for love is a recent trend, this idea of companionship. And the book talks about even with your relationships with your children. Relationships with children were not as intense as they are in these modern times. Our feelings toward our families being our number one focus is a relatively modern idea. Again, back in the day, you might have been closer to your friends or your neighbors than you would have been to your own family or your even wife. Because again, people weren't married because they wanted to be together, or they loved each other. Again, a lot of it had to do with the exchange of some way. And you could definitely apply, exchange theory to this, and that early relationships were based upon this idea of, cost and benefits, exchange theory, okay? So again, society was historically patriarchal dominated, again, male dominated. It was also, from the age of colonization on, was European male dominated. That since has changed as, again, European powers lost much of their power, but still, you still see the idea of white male privilege permeated across American society, and we are still constantly combating this, for ideas of equity, like women still make less money, people that are non-white still make less money, for example. All right, so things to think about. So, the origins of the U.S. family. And again, in colonial America, you had these political arrangements. It was male-dominated, and they had this idea of coverture. And this, again, is why we needed to have women's rights. But it took 200 years to overturn these ideas. But again, coverture is the idea that when a woman married a man, the female became part of the male's citizenship. And then your book talks about the idea of patrilineal lineage. And this is the idea that, a way to legally trace the name through the man's name. And I love the page in your book that talks about the idea of a woman not taking a man's name, and how feminists in the 1960s were very inspired to reject this idea of following the patrilineal lineage and, not changing their name. But again, that took hundreds of years from early America to get to that point where a woman didn't have to change their name because it wasn't mandated legally. Okay? So Native Americans, you definitely see a slightly different family type. It wasn't as inequitable between males and females in Native American families as it was in European families. However, they did still have the division into labor roles, but women were the property owners in the case of that. However, men had a little bit more power and say when it came into politics and war. That was interesting that your book talks about. But again, the Native American family, again, through the 95% of the population being lost in the wars and disease, was completely decimated. And so again, that's a completely side project, studying the evolution of Native Americans. In that family type, same thing with African Americans, Asian Americans, Latin Americans, because there's a whole lot of history there that we really have to delve into. But just to summarize it all, again, with the colonization of Europe, of the Americas, you had the cultural imperialism, whereupon we imposed American culture, and we also did this upon the families of Native Americans. African Americans, the sad story discussed in your book, again, these families were ripped apart. They were not only taken from their families in Africa, but then they were brought to plantations in the islands in Latin America and North America, and then their families were consistently stripped apart. Even then, you never know if you were going to be sold off or your spouse or your children were going to be sold off. There was some hope in there that, depending upon the size of the plantation and how consistent the plantation was, a lot of families were able to stay together over time, and the idea that African Americans spent most of their time with families. But how that family was defined and whether or not it was extended is something interesting to look into. But again, when Africans came over, we stripped them of their name. We stripped them of their family identity. Okay, we stripped them of their culture. And then we imposed a European culture upon them. And even after the 1860s, again, you have this struggle of families trying to get out of poverty because of the minority status, for example, and the effects of that. And then Latin Americans and Asian Americans, again, first, this was Mexico. United States, Texas and all that was Mexico. So all of a sudden, America took over, and there were already families living there. They were affected by that. Often Latin Americans and Asian Americans had to go to work, therefore they ended up being separated from their families. And then the book talks about, for example, Asian immigrants coming over and never seeing their families again, for example. It goes further and talks about all the atrocities committed, the treaty violations of Native Americans, decimations, slavery with African Americans, and then even upon the legalizing of African Americans to vote and own property, for example. We imposed Jim Crow. With Latin Americans, we have a lot of history of immigration issues and prejudice and discrimination. Same thing with Asian Americans with the Chinese Exclusion Act, when we literally took away their citizenship in the United States. So again, all these economic and political forces then interact with the family. And so how does things like that affect the family? But again, if Europeans are dominating the social class system and reducing minorities into the lower classes and imposing poverty upon them, how does that affect the family? So again, this chapter is just full of tons of ideas that we could talk for hours about. And, but it was, of course, sadly, we have to skip over some of this, but there's some really good, interesting topics in here. So again, I really like what the book talks about with the idea of the married names, but the main focus of the idea of the married names, again, points back to not only the establishment of the family and legalizing of the family, but the idea of where does this cultural trend of women taking upon the family name come from, and why is it that the woman takes on the man's name and not the other way around? And again, this is over time, the family at first was not regulated by the government. It was regulated by the churches. But then as the state starts to interact with the family more and more, the state becomes the authority by which marriages become regulated and approved. And so therefore, males, again, use their last name to trace the patrilineal descent. Okay, this has been challenged over time, and again, the idea of the feminists in the 1960s is a really good point where things really started to shift, but still, this is a cultural norm that continues to this day. And your book talks about lots of good problems with this. You know, what happens when a female changes her name, for example, how does that affect things like credit status and things along those lines? There's some really good, interesting stuff in your book about that. Again, the idea of childhood did not exist back in the day. Childhood is a relatively new social construction. Children back in the day played an economic role. And again, if we were in New York in the late 1800s and early 1900s, we would have all been working with our children, working in factories at the mercy of the bourgeoisie, the owners, for example. Okay? The book does give a definition of extended families that might differ from some of our own, personal ideas of what an extended family is, but it says beyond parents and children that live together. So the book is defining extended families not as, all the people that you know in your life that you might include in your family, but those that live together. And then you had the idea of the STEM family that your book also defines, and this is the idea that for many hundreds of years, the oldest child would then take over the family home, and then the other children would have to move out and kind of go make a name for themselves, for example. And this is another way that property was passed down through time. So during the emerging modern family, 1820 to 1900, you start to have some of this traditional ideology being challenged. Yes, you did have a family structure that was completely dominated by the idea of a male being a breadwinner and a female as a homemaker. But again, Susan B. Anthony is the late 1800s. This is again when women really start to challenge some of these ideas of traditional ideology and start embracing egalitarian ideology, which means a woman can be a surgeon and a parent, and a male can be a surgeon and a parent, and all is well. And that's equity, But again, historically, women were denied liberty despite what the Constitution said. So again, we passed the Constitution. The Founding Fathers had their chance to give women liberty, and they denied it. And the book talks about how states went way out of their way to make sure women knew that liberty was not for them. But still, that idea stuck. Even though the Constitution was not written for women or minorities, the idea of liberty penetrated the minds of women and minorities, and they believed that they could have that for themselves. But again, the Declaration of Independence was written for European males and not for anybody else, okay? But again, through this challenging of traditional ideology, men became protectors instead of owners. This idea that a male has to rescue a beauty, is this kind of idea of coping with that initial social change of challenging the male authority role in the family, okay? But again, if you guys do study global families, for example, women in most places of the world are more likely to be property than own property. So again, the state of females in the United States, for example, is definitely on the up and up, but in other places it's not so good, and you're seeing a lot of that with Afghanistan currently. Okay, so male authority has been challenged. It started to happen in the late 1700s, 1800s, going in the 1900s, culminating in the three waves of the feminist movement that continues today with the demand for equity, no sexual harassment, no discrimination in the workplace, for example, but still, you still see prejudice and discrimination existing until now. During this time is when you start to have the idea of the companionship arrangements rising. And a lot of this has to do with technological advances and urbanization. So as technology improved and people began to leave the farms and move into the cities, they were now more free. They weren't so closed and tied down. You had males that were living free on their own. Again, historically, during this time, women did live with their families until they're being married. But again, you had this mass migration in the cities, which was really challenging a lot of things. And one major thing it was challenging is the idea of the work role. So again, people were leaving their farms, and instead of having to do everything on the farm and having the kids have to do everything, and the wives and the husbands and everyone working together to survive, you start to get this capitalist, consumer, materialist society where instead you can go sell your labor to a factory owner, then use that money that you made from your labor to go to a store and buy these products that you didn't have to make yourself for the first time ever, again, because of the advancing of technology. Okay? But during this time, you had this idea of courtship. And so this is when, suitors started to come along. So instead of your parents arranging your marriage based upon political and economic needs, people started to think about marrying someone for love for the first time. You have this rise of the middle class where people are no longer tied down to the farm. But, again, because of that authority of your parents over the children that lasted forever, they developed something called courtship, where, a suitor would come to your house, your parents would have some formal arrangement, like you had some cookies and milk, basically. You decided whether your parents would like them, they would approve, then everybody would get married. But that improved people getting married, being able to marry more for courtship and love instead of just economic relationships. During this time, you also see a major drop in fertility. People went from having about 7 children in the early 1800s to about 4 by the late 1800s and early 1900s. A lot of this has to do with simply technology, birth control, condoms being invented, also personal choice. Okay? Childhood begins to be engendered about this time. Your book talks about how children had their own toys, how they had their own rooms, for example. All modern ideas that come about in the 1800s, for example. Children were no longer seen as the Calvinist sinners, but they began to have this age of innocence and, allowed to develop themselves over time. But during this time, some positive things come out of this, again, is that increasing emotional bonds. And the idea of a family structure being economic and political really begins to shift in this time to start to focus on things like but companionship and love and caring and really investing in each and every child. One reason is they're living longer, they're dying less, and you have more time to, you have less children to really spend all your time on. So even the book comments about how even fathers during this time start to open up and stop being so hard, for example, and becoming big old softies, okay? And then grandparents at this time are starting to live longer, so you start to have the addition of the role of the grandparent playing and their interaction with the kids. So a lot of really cool changes going on in the 1800s, okay? So again, just to kind of cover the change during the Industrial Revolution with technology and healthcare and medicine and how we ended up living longer and the changing of the family. Again, economic systems change. You had the increase of capitalism. So again, you had the rise of the owners and the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the owners and the workers. The owners had the means of production. The workers then took those means of production and created goods. People sold their labor and then they bought those goods. Migration to the cities, the increase in technology, all of this resulted in a transformation of the family because, again, the roles of the family themselves shifted. Because, again, we weren't doing all this farm work so much anymore. Now we were in the city, okay? So wage labor increases, again, with the exception of the farm families. But however, even during this time, women are still denied access to the state and the market. But during this time, women start to really carve out their role as homemakers instead, okay? So again, the class system expands, and during this time, inequality between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, inequality between the upper classes and the lower classes increases this time, and also inequality between men and women increases this time because men are the ones going out and earning the wages, getting the capital, and so women don't have access to capital, therefore they're still dependent on a man at this time. However, they do gain power over the home during this time, okay? During the 1800s and the early 1900s, again, you had the increased involvement of the state in the regulation of marriage. Specifically, polygamy became illegal, and monogamy was the ultimate standard by which to get married. And again, adultery was a reason to divorce because monogamy was upheld, but this was really a standard only held for women and not for men during this time, okay? Public education also increased, so that involved taxation, and so the tracking and the census tracking of families and who's part of the family and how that plays into taxes all became very important. So again, this is why the state started to, definitely jump in on the regulating of families and marriage. The state also came up with some of these, the social programs during this time, and again, this is the beginning of sociology here and a lot of the social activism, but the idea of caring for widows and orphans along with the poor and other people that need things at this time became a concern because as a result of the inequality between the rich and poor, the owners and the workers, you had this lower class workforce. And again, the problems with poverty are extensive. And so because poverty was increasing in urban areas at this time, for example, you had a lot of widows and orphans and nothing to do with them. So you did have this emerging welfare system at this time that began to support the family structures, especially those that are in poverty. But again, you have to realize that minority groups were continuously subjugated into the lower classes, did not get access to capital, therefore their families weren't able to rise up very easily either. So again, they were forced into poverty. And how does poverty affect the family? Guys, poverty has a huge effect on the family. So the modern family from the 1900s to the 1960s, you had this increase in the traditional gender roles up until about the 1960s, really about World War II, because during World War II, again, this is when women rediscovered that they can do anything a man can do, and then when the men came back after World War II, they were again forced into the homemaker role, and they weren't happy with that anymore. And so again, this traditional idea of, men being a breadwinner and female being a homemaker has been continuously challenged, but very much so in the 20th century. Okay, companionship families became the norm. Marrying for marriage, marrying for love became the norm. We had this cultural shift in attitude toward marriage. Again, meaning that marriage wasn't so much about economics and politics. It was more about happiness and love. Okay. During the 20th century, the early 20th century especially, you had the rising of dating and the reduction of courtship. And again, that's because the ties to your parents, for example, independence increasing, people being able to make their own money, living in cities. All of this challenged the idea of courtship and family structures and increased the rise of dating and choosing to get married for love. Okay. During this time, you also had economic changes in that the family wage became a thing. This is kind of how companies tried to make it so a female could stay home and a male could work. But again, the idea of only having a one-parent working household, even then, was very challenging. And that's why you see in modern times that pretty much it's, there's two-parent working households across the board. And so again, two-parent working households across the board creates incredible amount of dynamics and changes because who takes care of the kids? Whose role is it to cook and clean? And then, in Intro to Sociology, I was talking about things like second shift and how, yes, women have entered the workforce, but they're still doing a majority of those homemaking roles too. And so, but that's changing over time. You're starting to see a lot of males, definitely interacting more with their kids and doing more of the household chores and, it's starting to balancing out. But still, I don't think it's necessarily totally even and totally egalitarian. Even in modern times, it's skewed. It's still society and families are still kind of skewed toward traditional gender roles a little bit. During the 1950s, you had this huge spike in the birth rate. But again, this is incredibly rare over the last several centuries and really over the last 10,000 years. And a lot of this just comes from after World War II. You had a lot of people came home and they started these big families, and the idea of the nuclear family just kind of rears its head here for a second, where you have a traditional man and a wife and their kids living in a house together and everybody's happy. But again, this, as your book describes, it was a bubble. It's almost like a myth, okay? Again, the idea of increasing birth rates and people, just marrying just one man and one wife being married is just incredibly rare. Like, in modern times, like right now, 4 out of 10 women get pregnant when they're not married, okay? You have, same-sex couples and just incredibly dynamic family types that did not exist really in the 1950s. So the idea of the nuclear family as, the staple of American family is a completely inaccurate statement. The staple of American family is diverse family types because that's what it's really about. It's all incredibly diverse, okay? But again, during the 1950s, people started moving out of the city. The suburbs start to grow. Housing was affordable at the time. A car was affordable at the time. It was just a little bit of a different time after World War II. But again, I had to quote your book because your book says, the traditional idea of a nuclear family has incredibly shallow roots and is virtually a myth. And those are your book's words. I mean, I wouldn't call the nuclear family a myth, but your book does. So I'm just going to quote your book a little bit here, okay? So again, new family diversity. This is what a cookie cutter family looks like in America. It's diverse, okay? And it comes in all kinds of forms and fashions. So family structure diversity is increasing. You are having a lot more single-parent families, same-sex couples, divorced families, a lot of changes going on. You also have the increase of egalitarian families, where the traditional gender roles and the traditional gender division of labor has changed over time. You have an increase in cohabitating. And again, this has to do with changing social norms and attitudes toward what's acceptable. I mean, back in the day, for a woman to have a baby without being married was incredibly taboo. But in modern times, 4 out of 10 do. And pretty much everyone lives with the person they're going to be with before they get married in modern times, which is a brand new kind of idea that didn't historically exist for the last several thousand years, okay? Modern technology has removed much of the homemaking work. Again, so your book talks about the advent of washing machines and irons and all these things that just made having to work and at home a lot more easy. I mean, again, we don't need to be spending hours making bread every day when you can go buy a loaf of bread, at the grocery store for $1. You had the 3 waves of women's rights movement, plus all the other people that were pushing it for years before. But again, women's suffragists, the right to vote, 1960s demanding to be able to become doctors and lawyers, modern times demanding equity across the board, challenging traditional gender roles. I mean, it's been going on for a long time, but it's really culminated in the last century, okay? And so women's work has followed the idea of going and selling their labor to the market. Okay, so all of us that are not owners, both men and women in these modern times, have to sell your labor to be able to get enough capital to pay for your house and your food and take care of your kids, okay? But the idea is a woman is no longer dependent upon a male. Yes, males still make a little bit more money, but that's because of discrimination in the workplace, not because of competency, okay? And in modern times, a woman can get divorced. Like back in the day, even if a woman was abused, their husband was cheating on him, it was very difficult to get a divorce. But in modern times, you can do that, okay? So there's a really interesting thing your book talks about, and whether the family structure of modern times is more fragile than it was when it was about economic and political relationships. Because if it's based upon love, what happens when you don't love that person anymore? And so the idea is the structure of the family, maybe fragile is not the right word. It's just easy to construct and deconstruct families more in modern times than it was back in the day. Because again, anybody can just go out, find someone, get married, be married for 10 years, have a few kids, and then, okay, we're not as happy with each other, fall in love, have a good relationship with them still so they can raise their kids, but then fall in love with somebody else and have more kids. And then do that a few times if you want. So you see that kind of thing. People are having 1, 2, 3 marriages, combining families into big families with children from lots of marriages. And again, it's just very complex in modern times. It's not, again, that's why I say it's not cookie cutter like you would think, where it's a nuclear family. It's cookie cutter in the sense that it's incredibly diverse and you have to think about all these factors, okay? So, but again, their book also points out that the opposite may be true, because look at how hard people that were fighting for same-sex marriage fought to be married because they wanted to be together, okay? So even though, yes, you can get a divorce in modern times, that doesn't mean everyone's going to, okay? So a lot of people are fighting for this ability to be with these people that they want to be with their life and have that legally acknowledged by the state, okay? And so in modern times, it doesn't matter. You can have all kinds of family types and they're all justifiably legal by the state, okay? Children and emotional bonds, again, have been increasing for a long period of time, especially in modern times. And even in times now, you could say that childhood is really being extended almost into an adulthood because of economic forces and things that are actually forcing people to live with their parents for a lot longer than or with their family for more time than they extended. They wanted to, for example. So your book calls this the extension of parenting time, meaning we're parenting our kids long after we're 18, okay? And again, because of the increased lifespan, grandparent relationships are also increasing. And then urbanization, the effects of living in the city, in the suburbs, and rural factors. And so families based upon region, a lot of that has to do with how many kids. For example, people in the country, for example, have more children than people in the city. So, region and age, race, sex, sexual orientation, religion, all of these play a role, along with economics and, media and things like that. All this play a role in the family structure itself, okay? So again, this chapter has so much going on, a lot of major themes. We're talking about 10,000 years of family evolution, structure of families changing, the dynamics of families changing, the roles of families changing, how that's happened over the centuries, how we've challenged social norms, Some really good stuff in this chapter, so I hope you all enjoyed it. Have a wonderful day.